So, hello, my name is Rebecca Lee and I'm the Managing Director of Merck Life Sciences here in Australia. Merck is a vibrant science and technology company headquartered in Germany with over 350 years of experience in the healthcare and technology space. At Life Science, we enable researchers to solve tough problems. And manufacturers from pharmaceutical through to food and beverage manufacturers to assure their quality and the safety of their products. Today, there is no larger problem in front of us than the fight against COVID-19. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Nikolai Petrovsky from Flinders University and the founder of Vaxine today to talk to us about his development. Welcome, Nick.
Good morning.
So Nick, before we get into your development and the exciting research that you've done, can you tell us a little bit about the history of pandemics? What has it taught us?
Well, Rebecca, that's a really complex question, I guess. What we do know is pandemics have been happening in humanity, for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So this is not a new phenomena. And we know that we'll have pandemics in the future. And if we look at, how often pandemics occur, obviously they occur irregularly, but, typically we'll see a pandemic every 20 to 30 years, on average. There is some suggestion maybe pandemics are becoming more frequent. And obviously in the last, 15 years or so, we've seen, SARS coronavirus that almost caused a pandemic, except we were able to cut it short. We saw the swine flu pandemic. We've obviously seen worrying signs with MERS coronavirus and also with the different avian influenza strains lurking out there, H5N1 and H7N9, which fortunately haven't caused pandemics but could still. And now we've got COVID-19. So there's a lot of activity out there on the pandemic front. And I guess being a company that's one of our major focuses over the last 25 years or so has been pandemic preparedness, I guess we're more conscious of these things happening every 2 to 3 years in terms of threats. But, in terms of actual pandemics, maybe every 10 to 20 years. So it's a very fast-moving space.
And what do you think are the longer-term consequences? Obviously we're in one now. What are the longer-term consequences of this and into the future?
So certainly every major pandemic, has long-lasting effects, and it becomes etched in the minds and behaviours of the people who lived through the pandemic. It's a bit like wars and economic disasters like the Great Depression. It actually changes the psychology of people for the rest of their lives. And so, there's the immediate effects of the pandemic, both in terms of, the illness and obviously the deaths and the impact that has on people. There's the immediate economic impacts, but I think no one's yet even, has had time to think about what are going to be the long-lasting effects on people's behaviour that it probably, are going to stretch out the next 50 years or so from this particular pandemic. So the answer is they have a lot of short-term effects, but we do know they have a lot of long-term effects as well. Some positive, some negative. So the positives would be, we might see more emphasis on avoiding the next pandemic. The negatives may be that, some of people's behaviours may change, to the negative. People might become more isolated or more fearful of socializing. So as I say, we have to be aware, that there will be both good and bad long-term effects of this pandemic.
Absolutely. And I think it's a case, certainly in our lifetimes, we haven't seen something as significant as this as on a global stage.
Well, exactly. I think, people growing up in the last century, had enormous events in their lives, the First World War, then, followed closely by the 1918, influenza pandemic, then the Second World War. I mean, they didn't just live through one cataclysmic event, but many cataclysmic events. So we've had a relatively sheltered time of it, I guess, in the last, 30, 40 years. So I think for a lot of people, particularly younger people, this is probably the first sort of negative major global event they've been through. And yeah, I mean, that has obviously ramifications for them and how they feel about this and how they react to this and then how they cope with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming down to the work that Vaccine's doing, the company that you founded, can you tell us a little bit about your development and where you're up to? It certainly is exciting times.
Yes, so Vaxine was founded in 2002, so we're now 18 years old. And, our interest was very much at the start in making better vaccines because, if you go back to the last century, we had a lot of vaccines that had been made in the same way for like 100 years, essentially. And they, whereas technology had moved, a long way in that time as in other areas, but for some reason, the vaccines were still being made in the old way. So we saw an opportunity to really take the latest cutting edge technology and bring vaccines into the 21st century. So that was the whole focus of the company. And we were fortunate after 9/11 and the anthrax attacks in the US. The President Bush at the time felt the same way because he asked, "Where's the vaccine?" and everyone said there isn't one. And if the old one that we used to have was 100-year-old technology, the old anthrax vaccine. He obviously said, "Well, that's a crazy situation, and we need to bring vaccines similarly into the 21st century." So he put aside several $1 billion specifically for vaccine projects to modernize vaccines. And we were actually very fortunate to be one of the very first companies to be funded from those funds. And even though we were an Australian company, because I think there was just so few, companies that were interested in advancing vaccines at that time. So we got a foot in the door and were funded under that sort of biodefense umbrella funding. And we've been funded by the US government ever since. So obviously they've liked what we've done. And the fact that we are very cutting edge and that we're trying to make vaccines not just more effective, but we're also trying to make vaccines that are safer and better tolerated, which perhaps in the older generation of vaccines, people were very focused on effectiveness and there was less emphasis on safety and tolerability with the view that, no gain without pain. And in fact, we were just talking to the Gates Foundation a few days ago, and they were still expressing that view that surely, there should be pain to go alongside the gain. And we're saying, no, modern science says we can separate those two things. We can get all the gain with no pain. And that's what sets us apart from our peers, I think, that we're very focused on effectiveness and safety and tolerability.
Fantastic. Before we get into, I've got a few more questions about your development, but can you tell us a little bit about how do you go about making a vaccine? What do you do and how has the technology changed?
So our vaccines are all based largely on synthetic proteins. So in the old days, you would, if you had a virus you wanted to vaccinate, and in fact, some of the Chinese companies are still using the same old approach. You infect cells with the virus, you grow up lots of virus, you partially purify the virus, and then you kill the virus, using chemicals, and that becomes the vaccine. So it's actually killed virus. I mean, that often works, and we do have examples of successful vaccines using that, but the vaccines tend to be quite reactogenic. In other words, they cause potentially you to get a bit of a fever, to feel, like flu-like symptoms for a number of days. And also the chemicals used in the inactivation, are not as well liked these days because some of them are carcinogenic, like formaldehyde, formalin, and so although that technology works, it's probably not state of the art. Whereas what we do is we take genetic approaches, we sequence the relevant gene from the virus. We then insert that into, in our case, insect cells, which have particular benefits we can talk about, why we use insect cells rather than mammalian cells or E. coli. But we stick the gene into the insect cells that then are induced to make the protein, and we're able to then purify that synthetic protein from the insect cells. We've then formulated with our proprietary turbocharger, which is called an adjuvant. In our case, it's called Advax, that's made from a plant sugar. So again, very biocompatible. And we mix those two together, and that then becomes the vaccine. So it sounds easy, but needless to say, there's millions of steps in that process, as you'll be aware yourself, in order to manufacture that reliably and at large scale is an extremely complex process. But the science behind it now is very well established, and so that's why we can develop vaccines so rapidly compared to what would happen in the past.
And you mentioned around using insect cells. Did you want to elaborate on why you've chosen that path versus mammalian?
So yeah, I think that insects live, their body temperature is obviously different to humans and mammals. And so to start with, that means they're easier to culture because, if you want to culture mammalian cells, you have to maintain their temperatures at like 37 degrees because that's what a mammal maintains their temperature at. And that requires heating and they're very sensitive. So even 1 degree out of that in your incubator or in part of your incubator and the cells will die or won't perform very well at all. So you have to have very tight control on temperature. Insects, so insects are maintained at obviously more ambient temperatures. So you're looking at around 27 degrees typically, and they're less sensitive to temperature. So that's one advantage in a manufacturing sense. The other big advantage is that if God forbid your insect cell line was infected by another virus, then that virus can't affect humans because insect viruses can't infect humans because they operate at a different temperature for a start. So they're not viable at human temperatures. If you have a mammalian cell line, because that's maintained at human body temperatures and it's essentially similar to a human cell, if that was contaminated by some sort of virus, then that would transmit potentially to the humans receiving the vaccine. So it's just a theoretical risk, but it's a significant difference between the two. Mammalian cell cultures require much more expensive culture media. So because we use hundreds of thousands of litres of broth to culture the cells, obviously the cost of the broth is one of the major inputs into the cost of the vaccine. So because the broths that are used for insects are cheaper than the broths used for mammalian cells because they're less sensitive and need less factors added, that has a big impact on the cost. So that's another advantage, lower cost. And then the really big advantage that we see with insect cells is the way in which we express the protein can be rapidly changed. So and that's relevant, say, if you're making an influenza vaccine, because we know they change, at the drop of a hat, we can find a new strain evolve and replace the previous strain and the vaccine stop working. So you have to be able at least every year to change the different strains in the vaccine. Now, with stably expressing mammalian cells, to change a strain is a big, long, complex process that can take up to 6 months. It's too slow for something where you need to be changing the strains. With the insect cell system, it takes about 3 weeks to change from one strain to another. So if COVID-19 it adapts and evolves and mutates, as some people fear, I'm less worried about that, but it's certainly possible that the first vaccines will work for a period of time, and then if the virus evolves around them, we'll need to change the vaccine. So insect cells are just the nature of the system is beautifully designed to allow rapid changes, and so we'll be able to change our vaccine much faster than the people using mammalian cell expression.
Oh, that's wonderful. I guess what in terms of speed, but not only in terms of speed, but in terms of costs, I think that's certainly been a concern of governments around the world in terms of when we do get a vaccine that works is the costs around it. So that sounds like amazing news.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm always fascinated by cost, because we see that diagnostic tests around the world, which are being done at large scale, in most parts of the world, those tests are costing $100, $200 at least per test, and people are prepared to do that multiple times to be tested. And obviously, countries are doing hundreds of millions of tests and not quibbling at the billions of dollars. But then when it comes to a vaccine that's going to protect you potentially for life and stop you needing to have any tests, and people are wanting to have a price of $10 or $5, and I mean, it's ludicrous. I mean, the vaccine should be in the hundreds of dollars, and the test should be in the $5 to $10 range, and yet everyone wants it the other way around. I'm fascinated why they're prepared to spend so much on a test, which doesn't actually help you avoid the infection, obviously, and doesn't treat the infection, compared to what governments want to pay for the actual solution. So if anything, I would say the vaccines are being dramatically undervalued. And that's not good, because if governments try to drive the price down too low, as we saw with the old vaccines against diphtheria and tetanus, people just stop making them, because you can make more money developing a diagnostic test. So why bother going to the effort and all the complexity of making a vaccine? So I think we have to be really careful when we talk about pricing, that we make vaccines attractive at a price that encourages more development. That we don't just sort of try and squeeze the price way down to make vaccines, basically non-viable, because that's happened in the past, and that's not a good thing either. So they shouldn't be too expensive, certainly, but they shouldn't be too cheap either.
For sure, I understand. It certainly needs a balance from both approaches. So can you tell us a little bit about your development, COVAX-19?
So COVAX-19 is our candidate against COVID-19. It's based actually on our experience both with a number of pandemic influenza vaccines, which we took into human trials over the last 10 years, and also a SARS and a MERS coronavirus vaccines, which we successfully developed and proved that the SARS vaccine was protecting mice against disease. And the MERS vaccine was actually shown to protect llamas, because MERS is a problem of camels and camelid family. And so, in fact, they did in Colorado a llama challenge study and showed again that the vaccine was protective against MERS. So we do have a lot of examples of successful vaccines, including some in humans, based on our recombinant protein and adjuvant platform. And so we were able to take that exact platform and just adapt it to COVID-19 to create the COVAX-19 vaccine. So it's a well-established platform. As I say, it's the platform itself has been in thousands of humans. We haven't seen any significant side effects at all. And very well tolerated. So apart from maybe just a small amount of tenderness, at the injection site for a few hours, we really don't see anything in the way of side effects. So, which is obviously important because ultimately consumers have to be happy to have the vaccine, and so the less side effects, then I think the better the reception.
And I understand that you have completed phase 1 in terms of your clinical studies.
Yeah, so phase 1 is the really big milestone because it's easy to do things in mice, but we know that of drugs or vaccines that are tested in mice, less than maybe 1 in 1,000 will ever even get into one human, let alone multiple humans. So that phase 1 is sort of the biggest, I guess, hurdle that any new drug or vaccine has to face. So having got through that hurdle is obviously in itself a massive achievement, but really the job's not done until the vaccine's on the market and widely available. So there's still major challenges for us to overcome between now and hopefully the end of the year, when we would be looking to get some form of emergency approval or ability to use the vaccine.
What is the next stage now?
So the next stage now is phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. So phase 2 is really an extension of phase 1, but looking at different population groups. So looking at the elderly, people with chronic disease, looking at children. So there's a whole lot of groups that are not normally included in the phase 1 program, but then you have to obviously extend the study to them to be able to say, well, we have complete population coverage. Sorry, the phone keeps going.
Phone's running hot.
Yeah. We need to do those phase 2 extension studies, and then the big one is the phase 3, because there you're seeking to show that the vaccine's actually protecting people against infection with the virus. So typically that can be anywhere from 10 to 50,000 people that you would immunize, half with a placebo, half with the vaccine, and then you would follow them over time to see whether with natural exposure you see a difference in the number of cases in the vaccinated group to the placebo group. So it's very hard to predict with a phase 3 exactly how big it needs to be and how long it will take before you actually statistically see a difference in the groups.
Yeah, and in terms of phase 3, I guess in all of the clinical phases that you run through, how do you manage safety throughout those phases?
Well, safety is paramount in any vaccine development, and safety is the thing that you can't compromise on. When you're trying to accelerate a program, obviously you try to cut everything as short as possible but as I say, safety is the one thing where you can't compromise. So we're monitoring safety throughout all of the studies. The subjects, are monitored for any new symptoms. They have blood tests done to make sure that there's no disturbance of any of their, biochemistry. And of course you do various animal studies to again support the safety. So again, that's something that we don't ever compromise. Even for a pandemic vaccine, it has to be safe before it becomes widely available.
And how do you determine how long each of those phases will last or plan to last?
Well, normally they you wait till you finish one phase and then you start the other, and so phase 1 might go for a year, phase 2 could go for 2 years, and then a phase 3 could be anything from 5 to 7 years. So that would be 10 years, and obviously we need a solution before then. So what's happening is all the phases are getting compressed into each other, and for the most part running in parallel. So you don't wait to finish your phase 1 fully before you start your phase 2, and often the phase 3 will actually start alongside the phase 2 rather than after it. And by increasing the size of the phase 3, you can actually shorten the period to get a result. And that's why we're looking at very big numbers. I mean, in a typical phase 3 vaccine program, you might have 3,000 or 4,000 subjects, but that would take a year or two to actually get a readout. By increasing the size to 30 or 50,000 people, you can potentially shorten the readout time to maybe 3 or 4 months. And that's what we need to do to have a vaccine that's, available by the end of the year. We really have to make that phase 3 read out in maximum of 3 to 4 months, which means a very big phase 3 study.
It's certainly ambitious time frame that you've got, but I think I guess the whole world will be watching in terms of how vaccine developers are progressing with their phases. In terms of, I guess, once we get through all the phases, what's next in terms of the approval of a vaccine? Can you talk to us about the regulatory environment that you have to work through?
Yeah, so, the regulatory environment is complex because it's very different country to country. There is some standardization, but ultimately you have to get a vaccine approved in essentially every country you want to take it into. The regulatory process normally takes 12 to 18 months after you've finished all of your phase 3 trial for the regulators to look through the dossiers and make a decision whether they're going to approve it, or are they going to ask you to do more work on the manufacturing or more clinical trials, which may take another 5 years. And so that process can go on. And I know we worked with a company in the US who developed the first new flu vaccine using the same insect cell platform we're using. They took 10 years from the end of their phase 3 to finally get FDA approval. So they'd finished all the trials, but the FDA just kept coming back and asking for more data on this and more data on that, and it went on and on. Ultimately, the vaccine was approved, and it was still the same vaccine that had finished its trials 10 years before. The vaccine itself hadn't changed. It was just all the paperwork and the fine detail. Now, obviously that's not going to work for COVID. And I know some regulators, including the FDA, have said that they are happy to monitor the data during the trial rather than wait till after the trial to sort of have it all presented to them as a package. And so I think there are new ways of thinking being introduced that could accelerate the whole process, not just now, but you could argue, why isn't that the case during any time you're developing a drug? Why can't the regulator, work in parallel with you during the phase 3 to monitor the data as it comes, rather than, taking an extra year or two to review it afterwards? So maybe we'll see a whole new way of doing things coming out of the pandemic, but certainly different regulators are taking different approaches. I think the Australian regulator has not shown much flexibility to date, but, I guess, we'll see. I mean, and it depends on the urgency or that's perceived locally. Obviously, the FDA are prepared to bend all their rules and do things differently because, the US is in a terrible position with COVID. In Australia, where, till a few weeks ago, everything looked to be very quiet, the regulators were going, no, we're going to insist on all the normal processes and rules. Now, we have an outbreak in Melbourne, and suddenly people are thinking, oh, well, maybe it's not quite solved, and maybe we need to look at our processes too, and how can we expedite things. So it's a very dynamic environment, and we don't know 1 week to the next what the regulatory rules may be. Maybe it will be easier, maybe it will be harder, depending how we're going in terms of tracking this outbreak.
Well, certainly, Nick, sitting here in Melbourne, I can certainly tell you it has been an evolving situation over the last week, where we've seen the stage 4 lockdown come in, and obviously I'm in the office today, but But given that I am having a discussion with you, I'm not wearing a mask, but certainly we all are today in the office. So it's certainly, we've seen this change and how rapid things are moving. And you alluded to it at the start of our conversation about what we learned from pandemics, and I think taking that a different approach in how we regulate and how we approve, and that it's a more agile approach to development of product and vaccines and drugs. I think there will be some significant learnings that we take from this, and yeah, we certainly hope that the Australian government does the same in terms of reacting to the situation that's in front of us in Australia, and particularly in Melbourne here. I wanted to ask you about, because obviously Vaxine has been working, but there are other partners that you work with, contract manufacturing organisations. So tell me a little bit about, how does this get to market, or how do you see this? Because it's not just one company alone holding the charge. You absolutely collaborate with others. So tell me about that.
Vaccines are, as I said, complex business. And you would know that because, of course, Merck supplies some of the, equipment and reagents used in our manufacturing process. So you have this big supply chain, all the raw materials from, filters to glass vials to stoppers, the cell lines, the culture media, all has to come from different parts of the world. You then have your manufacturing partners, and again, we have multiple components. It's a bit like the car industry, where no longer does one company make all the bits. You'll have different companies making different bits of the vaccine, and then you'll have the assemblers, which is the Pharma of this world, who bring all our bits and your bits together, and ultimately they put it all together, and out comes the labelled vaccine vial, which, as I say, would come from Pharma. So yeah, the complexity of that is obviously enormous, because you are dealing with a big supply chain, I guess, and trying to coordinate those activities in real time. During a pandemic, when some of your partners may be affected by their supply chain actually having problems. I know Pharma a few weeks ago had problems with caps in India because India was shut down, and there was no one who could take the caps to the airport to transport them, and that was solved. But so you're doing a lot of problem solving continuously to address all of those unexpected hurdles in the supply chain. So it's a complex undertaking, but it's only through all of those partners functioning normally, and that you're able to make a vaccine. And so if one of those partners falls over, or can't do something because there's something missing, or their supply chain's disrupted, everything comes to a grinding halt. And I don't think people appreciate, just how important partnerships and long-term partnerships are, because sometimes, you're asking your partners to sort of go above and beyond to source things, and air freight them where they'd normally, which drives up the price, but, you need it. And so, it's through those long-standing partnerships that I think that you're able to work together as a team and realize this is a team effort, that, we might be at the pointy end, in the sense we have to ultimately deliver the vaccine to the government or the consumer. But behind us is all of these vital partners, without whom we couldn't do it.
So can you tell us a little about your experience, and what has Merck allowed you to do and brought to you and your organisation?
So Merck have helped us, and obviously Merck have a long-standing relationship to Pharma, which again, one of the things of this is that you have these relationships through other relationships, so it really is a network. And so when we were originally designing our processes for development, in fact, of our adjuvant, the turbocharger component, many, many years ago, we approached different companies, and Merck Millipore were happy to help us to really in that initial design phase where we, were trying to design a process that was disposable and that essentially wouldn't require all the complex cleaning validations and sterility protocols that were just not going to be suited to our product. And so they were happy to do that sort of initial exploratory work with us and help us as a partnership to develop that process that we were then able to take to Pharma, and they were then able to implement it. And obviously that's now how that component of the vaccine is still made to this day. And of course, now we're looking at, well, that was originally designed to be able to make, in the tens of thousands of doses, because that was our need back then for our clinical trial programs. Now we're looking at, so how do we make that process so that we can make hundreds of millions of doses that's going to be required in the next couple of years for COVID-19. And obviously we'll be working closely with Pharma and Merck to say, now, how do we do that like at 1,000 or 100,000 times the scale? And so we will be drawing upon, the collective expertise to help solve those challenges, because as I say, it's one thing to get past your phase 3, but then you have to face this issue: can we produce 1 billion doses of vaccine? I mean, that's a tall order, but the demand is there. I mean, we're going to have to vaccinate 7.5 billion people over the next couple of years. How are we going to do that? I mean, we have to solve those problems, and we can't wait till next year to solve those problems. We have to be solving those problems today, because they're not overnight solutions. The solutions take a lot of hard work, working with partners to find those solutions, and so we have to start doing it now.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what we're about, is solving those tough problems. So we are absolutely delighted to continue to work with you and Vaxine and Pharma. I think it's been an amazing partnership so far, and it's really exciting to see where we are, perhaps on the cusp of something wonderful that could really have a major impact in this fight against the virus. So thank you, Nick, for your time today. I really appreciate the chance to have a chat with you, and really look forward to following very closely the developments that you're going through.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and as I say, thank you to Merck for being a partner with us over all these years to get to this point where hopefully we can really make a big impact on a global problem.